Hello, everybody. Mike from Southern California again. Welcome to the debut of Squared Circle Calendar. Now, as I had mentioned in one of my recent channel update, I was going to start another feature that focused on the history of pro wrestling. This is going to be the set of videos that's going to do that Squared Circle Calendar. What I will be doing is, because now as a fan of pro wrestling, of course, I've sat there and I'll sit there and go back and I'll watch old wrestling shows from back even from before the time I was born. What I decided to do with that is I decided to starting with the debut episode here, starting from January 1975. Once I finish each month and year, I'm going to do an episode on it. This debut episode, of course, starts January 1975. I'll do every month. Hopefully, I'll stick with it until we get up to modern day. So, for those of you who are pro wrestling fans, who are pro wrestling historian buffs, I hope that this will be a good program for you. Now, since I'm starting, of course, in January 1975, particularly for some of you who are younger, now for those of you who are maybe my age and older, you may some of this stuff you may remember, watching as a kid or even hearing about, from your older siblings, maybe your parents, what have you. Um, for those of you who are like in your 30s and 20s, this might be something that you never obviously, January 1975, you may not even be aware of. Obviously, this is a time when maybe many of the wrestlers that you grew up with or were aware of weren't even alive yet. But some of them from when you were growing up, you may have heard of, like Ric Flair, like Harley Race, like the Funks, so. So as we go on this journey through the squared circle calendar, we start with 1975. I'm going to give you a little bit of detail. It's going to be it's a retrospect. Um, but of course, before we start talking about January 1975, we need to give you guys some basic information about what pro wrestling was like, you know, was like back then. You know, of course, North America here, the United States, Canada, and Mexico were the main countries that had a lot of pro wrestling. In Europe, it was England and Germany, and then in the Orient, of course, Japan. And we'll be talking about different things of each um, kind of situation there. Um, a little bit of background on some things. First off, you know, at this point in January 1975, at the time, what you all know of today as the WWE was known, the World Wrestling Entertainment was known as the Worldwide Wrestling Federation, and was actually a part of the professional wrestling governing body known as the National Wrestling Alliance, or the NWA. At, in 19 at the beginning of 1975, the NWA was the premier governing body for professional wrestling. Um, they now they were not they were not like what WWE is today. They weren't a national organization. They were what they were a governing body that had different what they called territories back then. Throughout the states in Canada, um, the organization known as Consejo Mundial de Lucha Libre down in Mexico, which used to be, as translated, World Council of Professional Wrestling. Um, its previous name was Empresa de Mundial de Lucha Libre, or um, wrestling, the world empire of professional wrestling. Um, so the end, and then of course they had affiliation at the time with All Japan. The other major organization was the American Wrestling Association, which which was at one point a part of the NWA. I think it was known as NWA Minnesota or something like that. The AWA, the American Wrestling Association, was founded in 1960 by Vern Gagne when he decided to withdraw from the NWA. Um, so so those were the two main companies, and then you did have a few what they called outlaw promotions, which were promotions that were not affiliated with any major organization. Um, you had joint promotions over in England, which was its own promotion, but they only handled. You didn't really have, as I said, any national, or even though what you did have in terms of the NWA board, um, they would they had control of four world titles, and these world titles were the world heavyweight title, the world junior heavyweight title, the world women's title, and the world women's tag team championship. Now, with these four, what they would do is they'd go around to all the territories and defend those titles in the different territories. You know, um, aside from that, any other type of regional titles were versions of, like, for example, you had you had a number of different United States heavyweight championships. You had up in Toronto in Maple Leaf Wrestling, you had a version of the United States heavyweight title. That was what they called the Toronto version. You had Detroit had a version of that. San Francisco had a version of that. You'd have a number of different companies that would have world tag team championships, like Central States, for example. Detroit again, and San Francisco would have the. And then, of course, you had, as I said, since the NWA was known for being a territory-based, you know, type governing board, you'd have each of the different territories all over the country, and Canada, and even, as I said, Mexico and Japan as well. So it is, just to understand that. Um, Also, of course, some other little tidbits to know and understand. Back in of course, in the 70s, um, Japan had three wrestling organizations: the International Wrestling Enterprises, which was affiliated with the AWA and World Wrestling Association in Indianapolis, and I'll get into that a little bit more of that in a moment. Which would mean that when they went off, New Japan, which would eventually become an NWA affiliate towards the end of '75, and All Japan, um, which was already an NWA affiliate and had a working agreement with the Western States territory in the States, owned and operated by the Funk family based out of West Texas. Um, All Japan and New Japan were born out of the closure of Japan Wrestling Association. In 1972, Antonio Inoki, who would go on to have the famous boxer versus wrestler match against Muhammad Ali in '76, was fired from Japan Pro Wrestling Association for staging a coup, and then um, he would go on and form New Japan Pro Wrestling in March of '72, and then Shohei Giant Baba would would later that year leave Japan Pro Wrestling Association and form All Japan in the fall of '72. Japan Pro Wrestling Association, or JWA as it was known, would come to a close in April of '73. So, and then of course the NWA, as I said, was primarily a governing body that ran, they weren't a national organization like you see today with like the WWE and even you could even argue like Ring of Honor and Impact and All Elite Wrestling, but they ran it through a bunch of territories. There, each section, like the WWE at the time, as I told you, World Wrestling Federation was based in the Northeast. You had Mid Atlantic Championship Wrestling, which was Jim Crockett Promotions, which is based in the Carolinas. You had all these territories around the country and they were governed by the NWA. So now, with that being said, with having at least some basic information on that, let's look at. So coming into 1975, Jack Briscoe, of course, was the NWA World Heavyweight Champion. He was he was he was he was coming off of the tour towards the end of '74, in which he dropped the title to Giant Baba for 7 days and then came back. Of course, among some of the top contenders throughout the NWA, throughout their territories, would include, of course, Bruno Sammartino, representing the Northeast of WWE, Worldwide Wrestling Federation, as being the WWF World Heavyweight Champion at the time. Johnny Valentine from Mid Atlantic, Harley Race, Dory Funk Jr., Fritz Von Erich, the Sheik. These are some of the big names from around the country that would be top contenders. The NWA World Junior Heavyweight Champion at this time was Ken Mantell, coming off, of course, going off a Japanese tour. Also, part of that same tour that Jack Briscoe even defended the World Junior Heavyweight title against Jumbo Tsuruta, which I don't even understand how that's possible, because I don't think even early in his days Jumbo Tsuruta was anywhere near 230. He was usually listed around 250. So for Mantell to be defending a title, now we had to understand with the junior heavyweight title, it's a weight specific title, which means that there was a weight class limit to it, which junior heavyweights, the basically the limit, the upper limit was 230 pounds. That meant, of course, that you had to be 230 pounds or lower to be able to compete for that title. The women's of course, championship was held by a name that many of you should know, the Fabulous Moolah. And again, she would go around the country defending her title against various female challengers, the likes of people like Vicki Williams and Casey, Susan Green, Donna Christanello, Tony Rose, and then of course a number of territories had their own women's champions as well. And then the women's world tag team champion were of course Joyce Grable and Vicki Williams. So with that, so that's a lot of the big name stuff. going into 75 in terms of um, going into going into 1975. So let's look at some of the more specific stuff. So in his defense of 19 first world title defense of 1965, Jack Briscoe retained his title in St. Louis at the St. Louis Kiel Auditorium against against the challenge um, of Dick the Bruiser. Dick the Bruiser, who of course was a wrestler. Also, he was the head of his own promotion in Indianapolis, known as World Wrestling Associates, which is was technically more an affiliate of the AWA, as you know, AWA and World Wrestling and WWA. They had more of the Midwest, you know, upper Midwest and throughout the country. That they were probably closer to what you think of as a national promotion than even the NWA. They'd hold cards all across the country and in the territories that weren't being used um, by the NWA, which would of course include Minnesota, Wisconsin, Illinois, the Dakotas, Colorado, a number of territories across the country, a number of states across the country. They would hold, but on Friday, January 3rd, at the Kiel Auditorium, Jack Briscoe would retain his title 2 falls to 1 against Dick the Bruiser. Now, understand that back in this time period, most world heavyweight title matches were best of 3, and there were a number of different titles in which the title matches were best of 3 falls. Best of 3 falls, 60-minute time limit. That was usually the standard for a world title match back in, even for some international title matches as well, back in 1975. Now, you know, as I was watching and stuff, I heard Larry Matysek talk about this a bit on, you know, St. Louis Booking Sheets 1975, in which Dick the Saturday before, because St. Louis NWA St. Louis would have a weekly television show known as Wrestling at the Chase, in which they would produce a wrestling show from the Chase Plaza Hotel in St. Louis. And so the previous Saturday, on I think it was Saturday, December 28th, 1974, at the very end, last Saturday, last show of 1974, um, after he defeating Bobby Jaggers in a match, Dick the Bruiser gave a very interesting interview with Larry Matysek, which it went something like this. I'm going to paraphrase a little bit here because I know Larry Matysek also paraphrases a bit, but you know he talked about, you know. So according to him, Dick the Bruiser said something along the lines of this: "I love Jack Briscoe. Jack Briscoe is my friend. He is a good world champion. But this Friday, I am going to beat up my friend. I am going to take the title. I am going to beat my friend. They are going to carry him out on a stretcher. I am going to I am going to put my friend on a stretcher for them to carry him out as I win the NWA World Title. I love my friend." And that was just, from what he said, a lot of jaws dropped on that because, you know, he respected Jack Briscoe, yet he was still going to give it his all to become the NWA World Heavyweight Title. Granted, maybe today doesn't have as much, you know, may not have as much polish or influence like it did all those years ago. but the NWA title was the title to go after, you know, at that point in time, you know. So, um, Briscoe, of course, retained the title 2 falls to 1. You know, I think one of the falls was a DQ win because, as was always considered happening, Dick the Bruiser did have a temper. Now, of course, Dick the Bruiser getting the title shot here was coming off of him being involved in basically a turf war or territory war with the Sheik's Big Time Wrestling in Detroit. The Sheik, the uncle of Sabu, who was a wrestler as well as being a promoter himself, based out of Detroit. They were having a bit of a war over who got the rights to promote cards. Because back in those days, back in those territory days, you didn't tread on another man's territory. That would be like trying to go into somebody else's house and claim it as your own. And that was looked at as a no-no. And if you did have some outlaw promotions um, coming up and trying to take over territories, the NWA would have a tendency to send in a lot of their more major talent to kind of drive the other business out of it, out of the territory. So um, to keep its power. Um, so yeah, that happened on the 3rd. Then the following Monday on the 6th, something interesting in Japan happened. Let me get to that here. So on January 6th of 1975, so that title match, that Jack Briscoe's first title defense was on the 3rd. On the 6th in Japan, in a women's tag team match between the Japanese team of Chiyo Obato and Kyoko Chigusa, they would beat the American stars Susan Green and Peggy Patterson. Now, there's a little bit of controversy. Now, by today's standards, this probably would have not meant anything, but back then, especially for a women's match, this would have been the way the match finished up was considered controversial. So this is basically what happened. Um, in a women's tag team match at an International Wrestling Enterprise (IWE) card in Tokyo, outcome was marred by controversy. When Obata and Chigusa's corner woman attacked and bloodied Susan Green, helping Obata and Chigusa to win the match. She bloodied her by opening up her head by hitting her over the head with a metal bucket. So that was what helped give and back, especially for a women's match, this was considered controversial because you didn't do stuff like that. Now maybe today we see it a lot more often. It's pretty commonplace now. And especially in Japan, because at the time the way Japanese would book their shows, they would book them as part of tours. They'd be, and you'd have, American stars coming over, and many times they'd book the hometown, the Japanese as the faces or good guys, and the Americans as the bad guys or heels. So, um, yeah, that was kind of controversial for the times, though. You didn't see that kind of thing, though, especially considering, in a women's match. So, moving ahead a little bit here, some other big news that was happening around the time. We move ahead to the 17th, in which Killer Kowalski would make his last professional wrestling appearance in St. Louis when he would wrestle Dory Funk Jr. for the Missouri Heavyweight Championship. The Missouri Heavyweight Championship was a title that was created by NWA St. Louis or St. Louis Wrestling Club owner Sam Munchnick over a dispute with how the Central States title was booked in the Central States. So we decided to make a title that was exclusive to St. Louis, the Missouri State title, which would eventually be, at least in the late '70s, early '80s, would become kind of a stepping stone to the world title. Many guys, particularly early on, um, either had already won the NWA World Heavyweight Championship or would go on to or become top contenders to it, and in some cases would eventually win it. Um, so yeah, so apparently what happened in this case was um, the St. Louis Booker um, apparently had um, had had booked a St. Louis, Kansas City guy, Central States guy, to go up against Funk in the match. They already had another match on the card that featured, another main event type match that featured St. Louis, and Sam Munchnick kind of nixed the deal. He said, so at the last minute they had to change it up to where, yeah, and then Munchnick just said, who was a good friend of Killer Kowalski, yeah, bring in Kowalski. Now the only problem was, though, of course, was now, and the second show in January is not always considered the best show for St. Louis at the time. Um, Now at this time, of course, they were doing their weekly TV shows every Saturday, and then usually the first and third Fridays of the month they'd have a main show, the arena show that had more feature talents, had like the bigger names and stuff like that on the card. Um, it wasn't, the Keel Auditorium shows were the arena shows were not like or not like enhancement matches like they were on TV. They were like, guys who were up and down the card depending upon where they were. But for the 17th, they weren't expecting it to be a big show anyways. So they brought in Kowalski. Kowalski at this point, though, was kind of at the tail end of his career. He was starting to slow down, but it was kind of his last hurrah in St. Louis, this last show. He wouldn't return. I think he would end up retiring in '77 or '78. Of course, for some of you younger fans, Killer Kowalski was the guy who trained Triple H, China, and Perry Saturn. So he trained some of the guys you would know, like he was a trainer of Triple H and China, but yeah, this would be his last in ring appearance in St. Louis. As far as I know, it would be his last appearance in St. Louis. Period. But but yes, this is So, and with that, let's see. That's um another. Yeah, let's see. The last full week, the 20th through the 20th through the 24th. It's a very interesting week for World Heavyweight Champion Jack. Oh, also I forgot at the beginning of the month there as well. Um, well, actually, I'll address those in a moment. So the last full week, the 20th through, well, I guess second to the last full week, leading into the last Saturday of the month, the 25th. The 20th through the 24th, Jack Briscoe had a series of world title defenses in Kentucky and Tennessee. On Monday, 20th, he would retain his title in Memphis against Steve Kovacs. It was a draw. Um, and on Tuesday in Louisville, he would retain it via disqualification against Ron Fuller, who was the owner and promoter of Southeast Championship Wrestling. He was also the current reigning Southern the the Tennessee version of the Southern Heavyweight Championship. So I told you there were a number of titles, number of regional titles, and some territories had their own version. Ron Fuller was the Southern Heavyweight Champion for basically the Tennessee area. Um, let's see, Tennessee, Alabama area. Um, then on Wednesday and Thursday in Nashville and Chattanooga, he would retain his title against NWA Mid America Heavyweight Champion Don Kent, who would also who at a point in his career would team up with um with Al Costello and later Bruno Baker, I believe, as the Fabulous Kangaroos. And then on Friday in Knoxville, um, he would he would retain his title against Nelson Royal. So he had a pretty busy week that week, that the 20th to the 24th, in defending his title. A couple other things to note, of course. Mid Atlantic Championship Wrestling would establish two titles in the month of January 1975. At the beginning of the month, they named Harley Race as their first United States Heavyweight Champion. This title was born as the United States Heavyweight Championship for the Mid Atlantic area. This is a title that would eventually become the WCW United States Heavyweight Championship and is currently the WWE United States Heavyweight Championship. So the current WWE United States Heavyweight Championship gets its lineage originally from the Mid Atlantic version of the United States Heavyweight Championship. The first champion was Harley Race, and the way they explained it in the storyline was he won it in a tournament in Tallahassee, Florida, beating Johnny Weaver in the finals. Um, Albeit all they really did was just give it to him, and he would, and of course, he would defend it. This title was defended primarily at this point in the Mid Atlantic region, even though it would, as I said, become a WCW United States Heavyweight Championship, which would be implied that it would be defended across the entire United States. And then towards the end of the month, on the 29th, the Andersons, also known as the Minnesota Wrecking Crew, Gene and Ole Anderson, were named the first NWA World Tag Team Championships out of the Mid Atlantic area. They were named the Mid Atlantic version of the World Tag Team Champions. Eventually, the NWA World Tag Team, the Mid Atlantic version of the NWA World Tag Team Championships would eventually become the WCW World Tag Team Champions, which were eventually retired in 2001. But but yeah, so Mid Atlantic Championship Wrestling established its own version of the World Tag Team Championships, which were held by the first tag team were Gene and Ole Anderson, also known as the Minnesota Wrecking Crew. As some of you would know, the Anderson name would become synonymous with tag team wrestling. Gene and his kayfabe first brother Lars Anderson um, started out in the '60s. They would, throughout the southeastern United States, would dominate the tag team scene. Gene and Ole would be a tag team force throughout the southeastern United States in the '70s, and Ole and Arn Anderson would also become in the early '80s, and then Arn would team up with like four other partners to become a five-time WCW World Tag Team Champion. So yeah, so you have the Andersons who were named, who were were named, and they were said to also have won a fictitious tournament. That's how it was justified. They were the world tag team champions, and Harley Race was the first Mid-Atlantic version of the United States heavyweight champion. And then also on January 29th was the debut show for the Universal Wrestling Association in Mexico City. Um, in the main event on that card, Anibal would retain the NWA. Let me see. He would retain the NWA World Middleweight Championship against Rene Guajardo. Um, Now, in England and in Mexico, they did have more than just the junior heavyweight. They would have multiple weight classes. In Mexico, I believe the middleweight class, the limit for it was, let me see, 70, 77. I believe it was 84 kilos, which would have been, I think, 185 pounds. That was the middleweight limit for the world middleweight championship in Mexico. So the main event was Anibal retaining his title against Rene Guajardo. This is a rivalry. They had basically, these were two middleweights that had had that were rivals who would constantly challenge each other for not just the NWA World Middleweight Championship, but also the Mexican National Middleweight Championship. That was also um, that was exclusive, of course, to EMLL. And on the undercard as well, you had Mil Mascaras, Ray Mendoza, and El Solitario beating Dory Dixon, El Canet, and Sunny Warcloud 2 out of 3 falls in a 6-man tag team match. Ray Mendoza, who was a former NWA World Light Heavyweight Champion at the time, um, had vacated the title and left EMLL to start Universal Wrestling Association, and this was his first show. Ray Mendoza, of course, was the father to the Villano brothers. Many of you probably remember Villano's Trace, Quattro, and Cinco from WCW from their time there as part of the Lucha Invasion, the cruiserweight division. So that those are some of the big stories that came out of 1975. Um, there were, of course, a lot of other things going on as well. Um, many territories were, like as I said earlier, Ron Fuller was running Southeastern Championship Wrestling out of, he basically bought out the territory in Eastern Tennessee from John Kazana, who was a promoter with as part of the NWA Mid America with um, but as I said, a number of different territories there. So with that, you guys can check the links below if you want to, if you want to um, contact me directly. You can go ahead and you know message me on Discord, or you can check out Discord and like it if you'd like. I also, and if you like this content, please consider liking, commenting, sharing, and subscribing. I always look forward to the conversation, guys. Um, if you have any questions, you want any more details on just how the territory structure was back in those days, just go ahead and ask. I'll be glad to explain it to you. And explain the different territories and all that. So with that, I will see you guys on Monday. Bye.